should not be born from just the desire to be different. So for some reason, I can't see the screen advancing here. I'm going to experiment and just like this, see what happens. Nope.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. That is really cool. All right. And despite the fact that we are living in this world where big corporations are breathing on our neck, medical innovation does not require always corporate authorization. Simple procedures we do every day, we can be pretty creative in them. So this is a thumb amputation in which a very significant part of the tuft is gone. It's certainly too big for a Moberg flap. Can we do something better? Sure we can. There is a flap that can be raised based on the princeps pulsus artery that can be brought all the way to the tip of the thumb, and it can be neurotized as it has branches of the median nerve that innervated directly from the median nerve. And these are the kind of things that we can do basically in a daily manner. And it's really part of our nature. The orthopedic surgeons are people that turn a plate and screws hardware into health and quality of life for our patients. In the process of innovation, there are two different ways the mind works. You have convergent and divergent thinking. Convergent thinking is what we are very good at. That is studying hard, figuring out things and taking a test and finding one solution to the problem we are facing. But true creativity has to deal with much broader world than a test. It has to deal with reality. And here is where the divergent thinking comes in. The creator must generate multiple ideas in parallel. And then he has to take different courses in his thought process. And then he has actually to come back and converge and choose among all the options he has created in his mind one solution. This is done unconsciously many times. The innovator must combine playfulness and discipline. You can't be crazy. And he must combine imagination and a deep sense of what's real. So this takes us, let me share with you some of my experience in the mid-90s. Distal radius fracture was a problem because even though most can be treated conservatively successfully, those that really were beyond conservative treatment, there were very few good options. I mean, K-wires and pinning didn't really work very well for the really bad ones. We had the external fixator, which is a really mediocre way of treating them. We maintain length, but that's about what you could do. So we have always been worried about distal radius fractures through human history, recorded history. 5,000 years ago, there's a papyrus from Egypt that describes how to treat distal radius fractures. He says basically you pull on the arm, you manipulate it, and then you immobilize it with splints made of wood and linen roll. And then you harden that linen roll with grease and honey. Okay, don't ask me how this works. I don't understand the chemistry, but that's 5,000 years old. In the 1950s, the AO group started, and they very quickly told us that if we achieve anatomical reduction in periarticular fractures, and we are able to achieve stable fixation and provide early function, the patients do much better than if they're treated with a cast. And this applies perfectly for the forearm. The forearm is really just one joint with two condyles. And until that day, a both bone fracture was a sure, the result was surely the loss of forearm rotation. And ever since we were able to fix these fractures with rigid, stable plates, then that went away. We can get great results these days. We tried to apply the same thought process to the distal radius, and very rarely it worked, especially for the dorsal fractures. The volar fractures did well for reasons that the biomechanics of the distal radius make volar fractures much easier to stabilize with a volar buttress plate. But the dorsal fractures were terribly difficult to stabilize. And this is a case, this is in my fellowship, I experimented with this a lot. I had a very, very nicely unsupervised fellowship, so I tried this. And sometimes in good quality bone, I was able to get good results. But this is more like the results I routinely got. Collapse, loss of radial length, and difficulty with forearm rotation. So used to operate all night long when I was a fellow, and the morning after, I would round with Dr. Burkhalter, my professor, who is the best teacher I've ever had. And my patients would be in bed with a big bundle dressing, and then I had to describe to the team the next morning what I had done the night before. And I had been working with this for a while. Dr. Burkhalter was not very happy with what I was doing, but he was letting me learn by my own mistakes. And that morning we rounded, and this is 1990, by the way. We rounded, and he saw the patient with a bundle dressing and asked, "George, what do you do?" "Well, I did a dorsal plate on him." And Dr. Burkhalter said, "George, don't you ever do that again." And really, this is so. Burkhalter was a colonel, a retired colonel in the U.S. Army. His experience came from treating injured military personnel in Hawaii in the Tripler Hospital. They would come from Vietnam, they fly them down to Hawaii. They would treat them. He had an incredible experience treating the most horrendous injuries. And he basically told me that I'm never going to do this again. I never did. I went to private practice, and I was treating everybody with external fixation or casting. I hated casting. You had to tell the patient, come back, let's see if it falls apart. And they were all nervous. They took an x-ray. "Oh, doctor, did it displace?" And I said, "Well, displace a little bit, we'll keep it, or we're going to try to reduce it again." And that was horrible. Every time I remanipulated one of these, I wasn't sure I did much for them. So we had a dogma at that time that was the dorsal fractures. If you're going to play the approach, they have to approach them from the dorsal aspect. And if you had a palmar or volar fracture, then you could apply a volar plate. External fixators were just for dorsal fractures. And that dogma was really, really ingrained in our minds. So in 1995, Jesse Jupiter came out with the pie plate. And I know very few of you will remember what a pie plate is, because many of you were born after the pie plate came out. But the pie plate was really a pelvic recon plate that had been miniaturized, and it was turned into this strange shape, shaped like the Greek letter pi, and it had fixed angle screws distally. It had these pegs that were smooth, and they would engage the plate and become rigid fixed angle elements. And this is the first time we could treat comminuted distal radius fractures successfully with internal fixation, the dorsally displaced distal radius fractures. And that was fantastic. But the problem was that immediately after this thing was launched, there was an epidemic of tendon ruptures. The reason was that these plates were very proud. They were very sharp. They had sharp edges. You had to cut them to size, and they would leave like extremely irritating rough surfaces. And it was really a disaster. The reason was also has to do with the anatomy. In the dorsal aspect, the extensor tendons are right on the bone surface. You can't apply hardware without being in contact with the extensor tendons. Now on the volar side, there is a very large volume of space in which you can apply internal fixation without ever touching the flexor tendon. There's a big muscle there, the cranial quadratus, that actually separates the bone from the tendon. And in the very same pie plate set, they had this volar T plate that was intended for volar fractures. It was very poorly designed because if you wanted to provide buttressing, you had to apply the plate quite distal. And if you apply the plate quite distal and you put in the fixed angle elements, they would go into the joint. So it was not a good volar fixed angle plate for volar fractures, but it was a great volar fixed angle plate for dorsal fractures. It was the only one in existence, and nobody had seen that you could use this plate for dorsal fractures. It had those pegs that we still use to that day. And I had one patient, I had done 3 high plates, and I realized this is just not a good idea. Difficult to do, difficult to shape. And I saw that volar T plate, and I had this little old lady with a Colles fracture that was very displaced, and she was very uncomfortable, and it was a very unstable fracture. And then it just occurred to me, why don't I put the volar T plate for a dorsal fracture? So this is the kind of fracture we started treating at that time. This is a year or 2 after the first one we ever did. So we would apply that volar T plate. It didn't have a volar buttressing surface, but it was good enough for a Colles fracture to stabilize. So sometimes the creative process is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking something different than anybody else has thought. Now, it wasn't really designed for this purpose. Let me get a little water. So it wasn't really designed. We had all kinds of problems. We had to cast them to immobilize them. So that brought us to design a plate that would be able to stabilize dorsal fracture from the palmar side. And I had a good friend who was a business major and was just starting a company that sold computer-assisted design products. This is 1998. So it was one of the first CAD programs. And we designed this single plate that would fit everybody in the world that was a volar fixed angle plate for dorsal fractures. And the way it worked, it had 6 holes. So if you had a right-sided fracture, you would use one set of holes. And if it was a left-sided fracture, you would use the other set of holes. This is because they cost money to produce, to develop, to produce, and we were totally bankrupt at that time. And we tried it. I was the only person in the world to ever use this plate. I realized this is really not a good idea. It was bulky, it's terrible. So very soon after, we say, okay, let's have a right and a left plate. And once we had a right and a left plate, then we had the freedom to start distributing those fixed angle elements in a more anatomical way, so we would cover better the subchondral bone. And that plate was manufactured by this company that now my friend worked for. It was called Biodynamics Technology. It was really a local distributor for osteonics, which was a total joint company at that time. But they also had some limited manufacturing capabilities, and they did this for me. So this was great. I was, again, the only person to use this plate, but it worked because it had all it needed. It was very strong. When you're fixing a dorsal fracture from the volar side, you are not using a buttress concept. You're using a blade plate concept. 100% of the forces have to be managed by the plate itself. We were able to achieve good support of the dorsal subchondral bone, which is essential or relatively good. You can tell that the volar tilt is not there, but at least we were able to stabilize these fractures. And most important, it already was addressing volar instability because many of these fractures are unstable in 2 directions. They seem to be dorsally unstable, and you fix them dorsally and they displace palmar. So from this plate, I got together with an engineer that was out of a job, and we started Hand Innovations, which was that company that brought out to the world volar fixation of dorsal fracture for the first time. That was on January 2001 that we launched this product, the first DDR. And that first DDR pretty much worked for some limited type of fractures. And by 2002, Diego Fernandez, who used to be one of the world's authorities on distal radius fractures, at that time he's now retired, and I published this paper that from here on the world changed pretty quickly. It took about 3 more years, and then everybody was doing volar fixation and dorsal fractures. Through the years, the concept has evolved. We kept on improving and improving, just tweaking the design geometry. One of the key issues is to get those to really create a subchondral scaffold, because this is not lag fixation. You're really not screwing into anything. You're creating a scaffold that will support the subchondral bone. And right now, we can handle the majority of distal radius fractures, volar or dorsal, with this concept. But there are still some problems to this way of thinking. And one of them is the volar marginal fragment. As the radius loads into the restored articular surface, it generates a force that displaces small fragments palmarly, and they're not buttressable because the volar, flexor tendons will be in contact with a plate if you place your plate too distally. Finally, that I consider to be the Achilles heel of volar fixed angle fixation was addressed with a hook plate, which in essence just completes the subchondral support of the articular surface. So it was not only about hardware to be able to fix these distal radius fractures through a volar approach. We had to come out with a different way of looking at surgery. So till then, we were treating volar fractures with buttress plates, and that worked pretty well because of the geometry of the fracture. And in order to debride the fracture, to be able to get an anatomical reduction, we just couldn't do it by simply reducing them if these fractures are, say, a week or 2 old, because the hematoma is organized. So we had to elevate the distal fragment up during the supinated position, bring it up, and then scoop out the hematoma. It is difficult, but it's totally doable. And you remove the hematoma, and then you can get your anatomical reduction. But for dorsal fractures, this just doesn't work the same way. Actually, it's easier for dorsal fractures, and that's what we describe as the extended FCR approach. It's a new way of looking at the volar approach, and I think this is the greatest contribution of my group. And what happens is, as Charlie told us 60 years ago, this fractures have intact periosteum on one side. In the case of this distal fracture, it's on the opposite side to the volar aspect in the majority of cases. And a hematoma will accumulate underneath this periosteum. If you wait 10 days or 2 weeks, it's already totally organized. It's a gel, it's not a fluid. So if you, no matter how hard you pull, how hard you try to reduce these fractures, you won't be able to get the length of the volar tilt. The solution to that was to get the proximal fragment out of the way. And that's by pronating the radius out of the way. That allows the surgeon then to excise the hematoma. You supinate the radius back into place, and then you can get your anatomical reduction. The extended FCR approach also includes a more distal release of your FCR tendon. With the Henry approach, you incise all the way to the flexion creases and you stop. But you have very poor exposure of the distal radius if you do so. So you must cross the creases, usually with a zigzag incision, so you can release your flexor carpi radialis tendon all the way to the trapezium. And when you do that, this is what you get. You get an extra inch of distal exposure, and you release the flexor carpi radialis, and that allows you to move the tendons and the median nerve ulnarly to expose the volar radius with very little tension. And you can see that volar rim of the lunar fossa, the volar marginal fragment, right now in front of you. Without the extended approach, you cannot handle a volar marginal fragment successfully. You might not even see it. So that allows us to treat fractures like this that seem to be very difficult, comminuted intra-articular fractures, with a volar plate quite successfully. It required also describing new anatomical concepts like the watershed line. The watershed line has always been there. The watershed line is where the flexor tendons come in contact with the bone surface, right proximal to the joint, but nobody had paid much attention to it because there was no reason. When we are using volar fixed angle plates, we try to get the plate as distal as we can without crossing the watershed line. Other things that came in handy was a way of provisionally fixating your fracture so you can assure you had an anatomical reduction and you had proper plate placement. And simply by putting bushings in the drill guides, you're able now to insert K-wires that show you where the screws will eventually end. And that, I think, it was a great facilitator of these procedures. Now, there also needed to be a better way to ascertain if your plate and your screws are in the right direction. So this is something that we incorporated from Dr. Pat Owens from the University of Miami. We needed a new way of looking at the distal radius, an axial view that was easy to do in the OR and did not need a big fluoroscope. So we had the flexion tangential view, also called the sunrise view. That view is very difficult to do when you're doing a distal radius fracture because you're using a hand table and you're using a mini fluoro. But if instead of flexing the wrist, you extend it, you're operating in the supinated position and you bring in your mini fluoro over the table. All you have to do is flex the elbow and bring your hand against the mini fluoro and take your view. And it will show you this picture that right now I'm on the stage of K-wires. I want to know if I'm in the DRUJ or not, and I'm not. Then when I apply my screws, I will check that the screws are not in the joint. So this is a picture of us looking at the extended tangential view in the OR. Today, the most common operative procedure performed for distal radius fractures in the world is a volar fixed angle plate. And the reason is the patients love it. We don't need a double-blinded, randomized study to realize that the patients do much better with this than the external fixators of the pins. Now, interestingly, nobody has ever done that study. You know, we orthopedics, unfortunately, are not pharmaceutical companies. We can't do these double-blinded studies. We have to rely on common sense and honesty on our results. So I lost count when the first 10 million patients had a volar fixed angle plate. And it is nice to go to bed at night and know that you've been able to improve results in many patients. And also that this concept has been exported to other parts of the anatomy to benefit other patients. And well, once you get bitten by the invention bug, it's very difficult to stop doing it because it really is a lot of fun. So after the volar plate and our company was acquired by one of these big monopolies and we couldn't continue on our track, I had to take about 5 years off from inventing anything because there was a non-compete here, but I was able to go back eventually. All things come to an end. And there was this problem, elbow instability, that I was aware of, and there never was a good solution. The hinged fixators didn't really deliver the promise that they made because, first of all, the pin tracks hurt, so patients have difficulty moving their arms, they get infected, and also applying this fixator so the motion in the joint was truly the motion that you wanted. It's very difficult, if not impossible. So this is a typical case. You see all the hesitation marks as the surgeon tried to find that axis of rotation. The solution that we came up with, which is this little hinge that is in the underneath the skin and has a pin that goes through the axis of ulnar-humeral rotation, was pretty obvious. I don't think that was so creative, to be honest, because the first hinge fixator that was developed consisted of a pin that was a real Steinman pin that was supposedly inserted through that axis, and then the pin was then connected to the rest of the fixator. So it was really just this is just making that original fixator miniature and placing it underneath the skin. So in this case, there really wasn't much of a creative thing here. What was truly challenging about this project was, how can we take the surgeon by the hand and allow him to reproduce that axis of ulnar-humeral rotation every single time? It took us 6 months to figure this one out. And the final solution is this. So basically, we needed 2 points to define our axis rotation. One of the points is the center of the medial trochlea. The center of, if we make a sagittal section on the medial trochlea, the center of that circle. And that was obtained by this guide, which is about 2/3 of a circle. We call it the antler guide, and you slip it in the narrowest part of the trochlea and push it medially until it self-centers all the way medially. So this is usually done through a lateral approach. And the second point is the geometric center of the capitellum. As you see from the lateral view, the capitellum is basically a hemisphere. And that will give you your axis of rotation. This took 6 months, while inventing the internal joint stabilizer, that was done in 10 minutes. It was just a thought, very, very quick. And now these cases, like a terrible triad with a coronoid fracture in a very heavy patient that can't immobilize in a cast. Now, they do fairly well, even though you can't fix that coronoid. This is the stability that an internal joint stabilizer will give you. You can not only flex and extend, but you can also pronate and supinate, which is something we couldn't do in the past when we were repairing ligaments. We had to be very careful with rehabilitation. And nowadays, these terrible triad patients can start activities of daily living almost immediately, because you know the elbow is not going to dislocate. So that patient that I showed you before is this lady. This is her first post-op visit. She's still swollen, she's still sore. And the first thing I tell her in the office is make a fist, because you can get CRPS with an elbow injury if you let your arm drop, the fingers get swollen and don't move the finger. So first for post-op visit, the most important therapy visit for the patient is the surgeon takes the patient and makes them make a fist. They're not stiff, so you can actually just make a fist for them and tell them continue. And then the second thing is I tell them, flex the elbow. You use your muscle, bend the elbow, and bring your hand to your mouth so you can start feeding yourself and taking care of yourself. That makes such a difference in the patient's recovery, the fact that they know that they can do it and they're not going to have a problem. And these internal joint stabilizers are removed around 3 or 4 months. You don't need them anymore. I remove most of them in the elderly patients. If they don't want a second operation, I sometimes will leave them back. So whatever we do, we must understand the problem. We must understand the root cause of the problems we face. And that requires a lot of preparation to understand how the human body works. We must know biomechanics. So it's very important to really get to grasp the principles behind what we're doing. And an example of this is arthritis of the base of the thumb. CMC arthritis is the most common disabling arthritis of the hand that can be problematic. And there's something interesting about them. They always have dorsal subluxation. And I always wondered why. I always thought that dorsal subluxation was a result of the forces of pinching, because I thought pinching was an intrinsically human thing to do. But if you look at our cousins, they pinch This is a chimpanzee that is feasting on termites by poking a termite nest, and he's using his ridiculously short and weak thumb to pinch. Most primates do the key pinch, side pinch, and they use it for feeding and minimal things. They don't use the thumb like we do. When you're pinching, the forces of pinch are applied to the tip of the thumb, to the distal phalanx. And the muscles that oppose that force come from a palmar direction, an ulnar and palmar direction. So if we do the free body diagram of what's happening here, we take the resultant force to the thumb, to the base of the thumb, we realize something very interesting, that this joint reaction force, let's look at it in reverse, is actually perpendicular to the chord formed by the articular surface in the lateral view. And this is obviously very well designed. A joint is most stable if the joint reaction force is perpendicular to the articular surface. So it seems that the thumb was designed for pinching. Now, how about gripping? So this is the way that the other primates grip. This is a gibbon. They use hook grasp. Their thumb, the silly short thumb, doesn't even reach the fingers, but they hang from branch to branch. They call that brachiation, with using just the fingers. Now, the living apes today, orangutan, chimpanzee, and gorilla, they have this very short thumb and this extremely long fingers. And they have only side pinch. Now, 3.5 million years ago, in the plains of East Africa, walked this creature, Australopithecus afarensis, that's Lucy, right? And if you look at her thumb, the IP joint of the thumb is at the same level as the metacarpophalangeal joints of the fingers. And this really contrasts with the other apes, which are much shorter. And to this day, the modern human, the proportions of the hand to the thumb have not changed. Other things have changed in the hand. We are able now to cup the fourth and fifth metacarpal. We're able to bring all the tip of our fingers together better, but the proportions of the thumb to the fingers have not changed. So this is what is truly human, I believe. It's power grip, because power grip allows us to use tools. Pinch is not as important. So this is the more modern, or the most recent innovation in the use of the hand. So let's do the force analysis. The forces of grip are about 5 times the maximum force you can grip. It's about 5 times the maximum force you can pinch. And I know that because I did this study in my patients as they walked in my office. Pinch, grip, and very easy study to do. Now, if you do the free body diagram and we find the joint reaction force, the force is much higher, but it's also not perpendicular to the chord formed by the articular surface. The metacarpophalangeal, the carpometacarpal joint of the thumb has a volar tilt, just like the distal radius, about 10 degrees. So it generates a dorsal vector. And if we lose the integrity of our ligaments to life as we get older and things don't work as well, then it tends to sublux dorsally. Once it subluxes, the osteoarthritic process starts because there's point loading and the cartilage degenerates. So our hypothesis was that the thumb is intrinsically unstable to grip, but intrinsically stable to pinch. We simply, in our lab, did a cadaver study, just like Cooney had done years before, with weights, and simulated pinch. This is a side pinch, a key pinch, or a grip, power grip. Then we proceed to excise all the ligaments around the CMC joint, basically got rid of all the ligaments. And we found that pinch remained stable whether there were any ligaments in the joint or not. But grip was totally unstable. So I'm holding here the joint by grabbing on the volar capsule, which I have not excised, I've let it attached to the thumb, holding it with a clamp just so I can let go and show you what happens. As soon as I let go, it dislocates, completely unstable. So there's a biomechanical issue is how can we control that dorsal force? Well, the solution was figured out by Wilson, who was a British surgeon in the 1960s. See, is you redirect the force by changing the direction of the articular surface. And if you have an arthritic joint, at least a hemiarthroplasty by changing the base of the metacarpal would be enough. So this is what we came up with. It's a hemiarthroplasty for osteoarthritic thumb. And this is a typical case. We do this operation in younger patients that are active because they require strength. They require a good hand function. For the older patients, the simple excisional trapezium is good enough. So the problem is that your trapezium is abnormal. So you have to sculpture a new trapezium out of the abnormal trapezium. Then that would fit your implant. Not an easy operation to do. It's difficult, it's very good if you do it correctly, but it's a difficult operation to teach. You have to work on the underside of the trapezium. Then we followed this patient and we found that the trapezium actually accepts the implant quite nicely. And then in the majority of cases, the trapezium hypertrophies and remodels to accept the forces. Now, well, we're not finished with the CMC problem, but we certainly found a solution for the young active patient. But there are other problems that are even more difficult. You should not be afraid of them. And one of the very difficult problems that we've dealt with is the scaphoidal dissociation. And this happens in younger patients, and it's quite weakening. And then as time goes by, they develop a slack wrist and arthritic wrist, which is a problem. So we've tried every possible ligamentous weave and every possible capsulodesis, and they all fail. And I think the reason they fail, because this is not a ligament problem. This is a problem of wrists that are entirely dependent on ligamentous function because the forces generated by load on those articular surface produce vectors that the ligaments cannot tolerate. And that's different in different people because everybody's wrist is completely different, like their faces are completely different. So why not fuse the joint? I was told that this operation doesn't work. They all fail. But maybe if we use a fixed angle plate and we use a bone graft, maybe we can get the joint to fuse. You know what? It is possible. You can get a scapholuni arthrodesis to work. And what's miraculous about them is the function that they can have. This is a police officer that had a slack wrist, and it was a big problem for him. And then we did the scapholuni arthrodesis, and look, his right wrist is the one that's affected, has slightly decreased flexion as compared to the left wrist, but otherwise it's pretty much the same, and the strength is great. Well, it worked very well on them, but I did plenty of these cases, and I didn't succeed in all of them. I would say about 50% of them were failure. And basically, I gave up on this technique because I had too many failures. And why does it fail? It fails because every human wrist is different. And many of the proximal scaphoids are very thin. If you create a trough to place in a bone graft, you have basically left just a cortex on each side. And it's avascular. You're really devascularizing your proximal pole of the scaphoid. So they have a lot of problems healing. So that's the problem. So how about if we don't use bone graft? So this is another case, and we came up with this idea. Well, if we devise a guide that allows you to cut the scaphoid and the lunate, just remove the subchondral, the articular surface and the subchondral bone, and then you can bring both bones together, rotating them around the center of curvature of the capitellum. You're not squeezing out the capitellum. You're not affecting the distal joint significantly, and you might be able to get them to heal. So here we are doing that. That's the jig. Here's the cut. We bring them together, and we designed a plate for this purpose. And this is the immediate post-up, and that is the the final picture. So why did this not really work like we wanted? First of all, impingement, the plate has to be removed. And another problem that I had not foreseen is that the whole wrist, if you shorten the proximal row, will then go into a DC position. It's like you create an instability pattern because the scaphoid has to meet the trapezium distally to generate that flexion force to balance the extension force from the triquetrum. And if you shorten the joint, then it doesn't work. So the whole there's no force making your wrist go volarly flexed, and it hyperextends. And notice on the lateral view, you have a DC looming. So we're not done yet. I don't have an answer to that yet, but we're working on it. Something else, intellectual property. If you decide to innovate, you have to be able to somehow own your ideas. If you don't own your ideas, you cannot have people invest in your concept. You cannot have a company back you up because they have nothing to win. So you must, if you have a really good idea, you must try to protect it. That's what a patent is. A patent is the only good monopoly that exists in the world. It's a monopoly that the government gives you for 20 years, provided that you teach the whole world all you know about that idea. I think it's a great thing because it really allows the whole world to progress. It makes other people realize, oh, this is great. Can I make it better? Can I? And it's good for the economy. It's good for everybody. And it's good for the inventor. The first thing you should do when you're protecting your idea is establish a priority date. You also have to disclose to the patent office everything you know about the idea that has been attempted before. It's very important to do that. And then you describe the idea in detail, including with pictures. And the patent officers will look at it and then decide what truly are the claims that you own. And this is one of the early patents of my experience. We've got a lot of claims, and the claims are quite funny because the language these things are written in, it's not English. I don't know what language it is. It's legalese. What all that words mean is a plate with a head and 2 rows of threaded holes, and 1 row is distal to the other, and on the lateral view, the screws overlap. That's what it means. Despite having patents, they will still copy you, especially if you're a small company. Some people get emotionally upset about it. I think that when people copy you, it's the best form of flattery. I mean, you know you're doing something well when people copy you. So once you have an idea, what do you do with it? So in some fields, you can actually go to a company and sell them the idea. They can see the value on it. But this happens in cardiology or maybe pharmaceutics. It doesn't really happen in orthopedics. In orthopedics, a good way to develop an idea is to partner with a company, become a consultant, get a patent, go to them and tell them, I have this idea, will you help me develop it? Can I develop with you? And they will do some sort of deal, usually based on royalties. Or you could do it yourself and create a company. If your idea is, can hold water by itself, the idea has to be able to support the sales force. The salespeople need to make enough money to be worth going to the hospital and servicing the case. So that just think about how much money a normal person needs to make in a day to be able to raise a family. So that means that the average product that can be sold by a salesperson has to be worth at least $1,000 because they get about a 25% commission or a 20% commission. And if somebody can make $200 in a day or $400 in a day, they're going to be happy. But if they don't, the idea will not take off. It will not support one company. You could sell it to another company, but you won't be able to develop it yourself. If you do it yourself, it requires the most effort, but you have the greatest control, and you have to set up an organization, which is not as difficult as it sounds. So let me just show you what we're doing these days. This is my office in Miami. It's a 2-story building. The lower floor is the medical practice. I like plants, so I have a lot of these trees around. The second floor is the engineering office. That's where the creative center is. And if you walk in, you see all the smoke coming out through the windows because you have all these smart young engineers sitting down, coming out with new ideas. It's really a pleasure to work with them. On the first floor, my partners and myself are treating people. We have a small surgery center in which I can bring down one of these smart guys and tell them, look at the problem I have. How do you think we should solve it? We also have our own lab where we do our own research. This is the experiment on that thumb that I showed you. And this gentleman here, Michael Mijares, was a medical student, just finished medical school and did not match in his residency. So he came to work with us, worked 2 years, we did all this research, and he finished last year his fellowship as a sports medicine orthopedist. He did his orthopedic residency and his fellowship after this picture. We do teach a lot. A lot of my work is to go around the world and teach people, teach surgeons of our concepts and our philosophy. We have a team of wonderful salespeople and administrators. It's a lot of fun to work with them. And very important, I am fortunate to have a lot of friends, surgeons that are bright, very dedicated, and want to make the world a better place. So we get together and we discuss how can we improve surgery. Innovation must be based on science. And I think there are basically 2 types of scientists. You have the innovator, the guy that comes up with a new idea, but that's not enough. You need to have the skeptic, you need the confirmator, the guy that doesn't accept anything new and sticks to the old and has his purpose is to discredit new ideas. And I love them because they keep you honest. Otherwise, you really start believing yourself. And we all make mistakes. I don't know. I'm not talking personally about anybody. So the sciences that are relevant here in orthopedics are the basic science: physics, biology, anatomy, biomechanics. It's just physics applied to the body. And material science. Material science, I had no idea about material science until computers came around. You can learn anything you want just by paying attention, dedicating some time, and doing research on the computer. Everything is at our fingertips these days. The science that I don't like are accounting. I really dislike bean counters because they put money ahead of principles. And you will make good money no matter what. You don't have to make all the money in the world, but you have to do the best you can. And I don't like jurisprudence because all they think is about the risks that you're facing. Who cares about the risk? It's about achieving the goals. So my advice is break free from restrictive thinking and let go and use the force. You need freedom to do that. So be careful of institutional shackles. The hospitals and the hospital and the universities might require you to assign your intellectual property to them, or at least part of intellectual property to them so they control it when you sign up with them. And if you're not aware of this, you will sign on the line because they offer you a good job and a good salary. But they will, somewhere in those 30 pages of that they give you, there is a statement that says that if you invent anything, it belongs to them. So be careful of that. And they will be willing to give that up because they really don't think that it's not really that important for them. What's important for them is that you work for them. So keep an eye on that. Champion your ideas. It's really a long process to innovate. You must enjoy every single day. You must be determined. You have to be courageous and persistent. Hard-headedness is a great quality to have. And I did it myself, and I advise to you to try to do it yourself too. You need to have a good family support. My wife used to think that I was nuts because we were not going to be able to send our kids to college because I was throwing all my money away in my crazy ideas. And I'm very proud to say that my daughter joined my practice 6 months ago, and she is my partner in my orthopedic practice. So she was able to go to college. So you guys are the future of innovation. Go forth and set the world on fire. Thank you very much. I have a question. Going back to your original innovation on this place. Is there anything that you believe that the screws and distribution were threaded or not? Is there any concern putting it all, putting that screw as close as possible to that fixation? People talk about only putting the pegboards to 75% of the level that can be fixation. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So the problem of smooth pegs versus threaded screws, we orthopods love to screw things. It's in our nature. But when we're supporting a subchondral plate, there really is nothing to purchase on. What we're creating is a scaffold to hold it in space. I personally think that on osteoporotic bone, if you have threads and the patient starts to rehabilitate early, the threads can act like a file and they could probably damage the bone. Many times, the screws or the pegs are seen through the articular surface. And that is a very big problem because you have to remove that plate before the wrist falls apart. So, but that happens very, very seldom if you do things carefully. I think the majority of these, I went through the articular surface because it was a technical thing. It wasn't detected in the operating room. So it was a complex articular fracture and some of the screws ended up in the wrong place. But I really think that the threads don't add anything. On the other hand, they could damage the bone more after rehabilitation is started. In terms of the length, the problem is that if the screw is too long and it goes through the dorsal cortex, then we can end up in the same place where the pie plate was, which is injuring the extensor tendons. So the pegs should always be below the dorsal cortex. It's very thin cortex, so there's very little purchase to be gained up there. Whether the way I do it is I measure the length of the screw. I always drill through the second cortex, measure the length, and I always subtract 2 millimeters off. But I try to be as close as I can, but not through. When you have the dorsal ulnar fragments, smaller dorsal ulnar fragments, if the fragment is very small, really it's not a big deal because the loads are carried on the lunate fossa all the way palmar on the volar aspect. The dorsal fragment has very little load and you can live without a small dorsal fragment. It's a very large dorsal fragment, then they're necessary to maintain their risk reduced. Those are the cases in which threads might come in handy. But that happens only in young patients with good quality bone, that the threads will purchase something to prevent the lunate fossa from splaying apart. So in my practice, I will use threaded screws in young patients with large dorsal ulnar fragments that I want to really stabilize. So I have some more cases to discuss if should we do that? 5-minute break. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.